A wealthy man, Robert Harmon, handed $400 to a homeless woman, suggesting she use it to buy food for her child. The next morning, he was shocked to see her at the grave of his beloved, who had passed away 26 years ago. Robert Harmon sat alone in an upscale restaurant in San Francisco, though the opulence around him felt hollow. Nothing could fill the emptiness he carried inside. He stared out the rain-splattered window, watching as droplets slid down like tears, mirroring the weight on his heart. Outside, the world was a bleak reflection of his mood. Always raining, always dark, always lonely. It had been like this for more than 2 decades since his wife, Sarah, had tragically passed away. Since her death, Robert had felt an emptiness that no amount of money or success could fill. He had built an empire of wealth, yet each accomplishment felt empty. Business events and grand dinners only served as distractions from the constant ache he bore daily. Robert absent-mindedly swirled his glass of wine, watching the liquid turn. Business deals, lavish dinners, and fancy events all felt meaningless to him, devoid of any true enjoyment. He let out a deep sigh, the years of loneliness pressing down on him. Despite his success, Robert was utterly alone. He had no children, none that he knew of. Sarah had never wanted to discuss children, and he hadn't pressed the subject. Now he regretted not having some part of her left in the world. Someone to protect, someone to cherish. After paying his bill, he stood up, slipping on his wool coat. The restaurant was alive with laughter and conversation, but to him, it was just background noise, as if it belonged to another world. Stepping out onto the wet sidewalk, where the rain kept coming down in a cold, steady drizzle, Robert felt only the chill and the emptiness in his soul. The city buzzed with life around him, yet he felt none of it. As he walked home, he passed by places he and Sarah had once enjoyed together. Every street, every corner brought back memories of simpler, happier times. Now, only ghosts and a gravestone remained. Like most days, he would visit Sarah's resting place the next day. Though Paris might have seemed a more fitting place for her grave, she had chosen San Francisco, a decision he never fully understood. Perhaps the city symbolized their new life together, a life that had been abruptly cut short. As Robert walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something under a store awning caught his eye. A young woman sat huddled there, clutching a baby tightly in her arms. Her damp hair clung to her face, making her look delicate and frail. The sight stirred something deep within Robert, awakening feelings he hadn't known were still there. He stopped, unsure of what to do. Normally, he wouldn't involve himself with strangers in need. He had donated generously to charities but rarely encountered people directly. Yet, there was something about this woman that made him pause. Maybe it was the way she held her child, with a tenderness that tugged at his heart. Robert slowly approached her, the rain dripping from his coat. "Here," he said, pulling out $400 in cash, which he had just taken from the bank. He handed it to her. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up, her eyes wide with surprise that quickly turned to gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you so much." For a brief moment, Robert felt a connection to this stranger, as if their pain was somehow shared. He just nodded and walked away, but he couldn't shake the feeling of that brief encounter. When he finally returned home, he was weary, both physically and emotionally. As he lay in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of rain on the window, the only sound in his empty room, he couldn't get the image of the woman and her baby out of his mind. The next day, as always, he would visit Sarah's grave, though he had no idea that this visit would change everything for him. The next morning, Robert followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to Sarah's grave. The sky outside was as gray as his mood, and the city still seemed soaked from last night's rain. Putting on his coat, he left his home, feeling the familiar weight settle over him, readying himself for another solemn visit to the cemetery. As he walked toward the cemetery, he found his mind wandering back to the young woman and her baby. He couldn't understand why he couldn't shake the memory. Over the years, he had encountered many people in need, but this experience felt different. There was something in her eyes, a combination of desperation and something he couldn't quite place, that disturbed him. When he reached the cemetery, he took the familiar path towards Sarah's grave. It was quiet, with only the occasional sound of the wind in the trees and the distant hum of the city. He knew this place too well. Each visit was the same. He would stand in front of her headstone, talk to her as though she were still there, then leave, feeling the same emptiness that had followed him since the day she died. But today was different. As he approached the grave, Robert noticed someone kneeling before Sarah's headstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was the young woman from the night before, with her baby still cradled in her arms, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. Robert froze, his mind racing. How could she be here? How could she know about Sarah? The coincidence felt eerie, leaving him unsettled. He took a cautious step forward. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn coat. "I am sorry," she murmured, trying to pull herself together. "I did not mean to intrude." Robert shook his head, still trying to process what he was seeing. "You were there yesterday," he said slowly, recalling their encounter outside the restaurant. "I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at her baby, as if their connection to him explained her presence. But for Robert, it was not enough. He needed to know why this woman, a stranger, was at his wife's grave. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone growing firmer. "How do you know Sarah?" The woman hesitated, her face conflicted, as though she were debating whether to share her story. Finally, with a deep breath, she looked him in the eye, her gaze filled with sorrow and resolve. "Sarah," she said quietly, "was my mother." Robert felt the world shift as he processed her words. His breath caught in his chest, and he found himself staring at her in disbelief. "Your mother," he repeated in a hoarse whisper. That cannot be possible. Sarah, she never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she replied softly. "She had me. She just never told you." His mind raced as he struggled to make sense of her words. None of it added up. Sarah could not have had a child without telling him. She would not have kept something so monumental from him. Or would she? Robert took a step back, the weight of this revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That cannot be true. There's just no way." "I know it is hard to believe," the woman said, her voice soft but steady, "but it is the truth. My name is Sophie, and Sarah was my mother." Robert's chest tightened as her words began to sink in. He looked at Sophie, then at the baby in her arms, his mind flooded with questions he did not know how to ask. How could this have happened? How could he not have known? "Why?" he finally managed, his voice breaking. "Why would she keep this from me?" Sophie glanced down at the ground, her expression clouded with sadness. "I do not know," she admitted. "I never got the chance to meet her. She passed away when I was a baby, and I was raised by another family." Robert's heart pounded as he tried to process her words. He had spent over 25 years mourning his wife, convinced he had known her entirely. Now, he was confronted with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound it changed everything. He took a deep breath, feeling a storm of emotions building within him. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why are you here?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, Robert saw a glimmer of Sarah in them. "I found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I have been trying to piece together the truth ever since. When I discovered where she was buried, I knew I had to come." Robert continued to stare, struggling to make sense of this revelation. His emotions swirled, confusion, disbelief, and a raw sense of betrayal. But beneath it all, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Hope that somehow this connection to Sarah had not been entirely lost. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and a shift occurred within him. If what Sophie was saying was true, if Sarah had indeed been her mother, then this child was his grandchild, a part of Sarah that still existed in the world. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief. He didn't know what to say, but he understood one thing. His life had just changed in a way he had never anticipated. Robert stood frozen, staring at Sophie, his mind trying to catch up with the weight of her revelation. The wind picked up, rustling leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. The baby in Sophie's arms let out a soft whimper, and the sound snapped him out of his daze. How is this possible? Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind raced with questions, feeling a betrayal of the very memory of Sarah, as if the woman he had mourned for so long had been someone entirely different. Yet even in his confusion, he knew one thing. Sophie believed what she was saying. "I know this is a lot to take in," Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. "I spent my whole life trying to understand too, but I'm telling you the truth. Sarah was my mother." Robert's chest tightened. "Why didn't she tell me?" he muttered, almost to himself. The thought that Sarah had kept something so monumental from him was unbearable. He had spent countless nights imagining what their life could have been if things had been different, and now, those what-ifs had taken on a new, painful meaning. Sophie shook her head slowly, empathy filling her gaze. "I don't know why she kept it from you. I never had the chance to ask. She passed away when I was a baby." Robert's thoughts swirled, and he struggled to focus. There had to be more to this story. "Who raised you, then?" he asked, his voice trembling. "If Sarah was your mother, why did I not know about you?" Sophie shifted uncomfortably, glancing down as if the weight of her explanation was almost too much to bear. "After she died, I was placed with another family. I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents until recently. I only had her name and bits of information I could piece together. I didn't even know where to begin looking for you until a few months ago." Robert's heart ached. He had spent his life believing he knew all there was to know about Sarah, only to discover that there were entire chapters of her life he had never read. "So you came here looking for answers?" Sophie nodded. "Yes. I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come." Robert's gaze fell to Sarah's headstone, her name etched in cold, unyielding stone. Visiting this grave had been his ritual, his way of connecting with her and finding peace in her absence. Now, standing here with Sophie and the baby, that peace felt shattered. Everything felt different. His memories, his grief, his very understanding of who Sarah had been. Taking a deep breath, Robert tried to steady himself in the whirlwind of emotions. Then he looked at the baby in Sophie's arms, his voice barely steady as he asked, "And this baby? Is this my grandchild?" Sophie looked down at the baby, a soft smile breaking through her tension. "Yes," she said quietly. "His name is David." Robert stared at the baby, who looked so small and fragile, and felt his heart swell with a mix of disbelief and something he hadn't felt in so long: hope. David represented a connection to Sarah, a glimpse of the life they might have had together. As he took this in, the weight of it threatened to overwhelm him. For years, he had been trapped in the past, mourning Sarah and the life they'd lost. Now, he realized that life had continued quietly without him, and he had a chance to reclaim a piece of it. But the feeling of betrayal remained. How could Sarah have kept this from him? How could she make such a monumental decision alone, without even telling him she was pregnant? "I don't understand," Robert finally said, his voice hoarse. "Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone?" Sophie's face softened, though her eyes reflected a deep sadness. "I don't know the details, but I can't imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child, or maybe she thought you were too focused on your career to be a father. I don't know, Robert. I wish I did." Robert shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide." Sophie nodded slowly. "Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you." The idea that Sarah had kept Sophie a secret out of a misplaced sense of protection left Robert feeling conflicted. He had always believed that Sarah trusted him, that they were partners in everything. Now he saw that there were parts of her he had never truly known. Looking back at Sophie, he felt a strange connection, not only to her but to the life he never knew existed, to possibilities that had been lost but could now be reclaimed. "What do you want from me?" Robert asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then met his gaze. I don't want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from. And I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife. Robert nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. The truth about Sarah. The truth he had lived without for so long. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. His life had just changed forever. There was no going back to how things had been. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Robert stood in silence, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what Sophie had just revealed. Sarah had a daughter, his daughter, a life he had never known, hidden from him all these years. The betrayal stung deeply, layered with confusion, regret, and something else he hadn't anticipated: responsibility. Sophie and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to share. But here they were, standing right in front of him, as real as the memories he clung to. I still don't understand, Robert finally said, his voice quieter now, the edge of anger softening. Sarah never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me? Sophie's eyes softened with empathy. I don't know her reasons, Robert, she said gently. I've asked myself the same question countless times, but I've never gotten any answers. All I know is that she made a choice, for reasons only she understood, and it has affected both of us. Robert took a deep breath, his thoughts churning. Sarah had always been private, even with him. They had argued about her tendency to keep things to herself, but this was a secret he could never have imagined. Do you know anything about her? He asked, his voice tentative, as though he feared the answer. Anything that might explain why she did it? Sophie sighed, glancing down at the baby. I wish I knew more. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months piecing things together, and there are still so many gaps. But one thing is clear. She loved you. Robert's eyes widened. She told you that? No, Sophie replied, shaking her head, but I can see it in everything I've found. The way she talked about you to others, the way she lived her life. It's clear you meant a lot to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things. Robert clenched his jaw, a mix of frustration and sadness filling him. He had spent years trying to make sense of Sarah's death, to find peace with the future they'd lost. Now, he wasn't only grieving her loss. He was grieving the life he had never known, the daughter he had never been given the chance to raise. And you, why now? Robert asked, his voice strained. Why did you come looking for me? Sophie held his gaze, surprising him with her calmness. I only found out Sarah was my mother a few months ago. Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about my adoption. Once I learned the truth, I knew I had to come, to find out more about who I am and where I came from. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I would find. Robert's breath caught. He could see the weight Sophie carried in her expression, the burden of a past she hadn't known. That burden now belonged to him as well. He looked at the baby in her arms, now fast asleep, the gentle rise and fall of his tiny chest seeming almost surreal. This was his grandson, his own blood, a continuation of the life he'd once shared with Sarah, hidden from him for all these years. David, Sophie said, almost as if reading his thoughts. His name is David. Robert's gaze softened as he looked at the baby. David'll, he repeated quietly, the name feeling strange but also grounding, anchoring him to this new reality. For so long, he had felt adrift, moving through life without purpose. But now, standing here with Sophie and David, something was shifting inside him. I didn't come here to ask for anything, Sophie continued, pulling Robert from his thoughts. I don't expect you to play any role in my life, or in David's. I just needed to know the truth about where I came from. And now I do. Robert looked at her, feeling a pull in his chest. He wasn't sure what Sophie wanted from him, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't walk away from her. You're my daughter, he said, the words heavy and foreign in his mouth. He had never imagined himself saying those words, least of all in a cemetery, standing by Sarah's grave. And that makes David my grandson. Sophie's expression was cautious, uncertain of where he was going. Robert looked at her steadily. I've spent my whole life building something, he said softly, but none of it really mattered. Not after Sarah passed. I didn't have anything left. But now I'm realizing I may still have a chance to be more than just a businessman. Sophie blinked, a mix of surprise and skepticism on her face. What are you saying? I'm saying, if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your life, Robert said, his voice breaking slightly. I've missed so much already. I don't want to miss any more. Sophie's face was unreadable as she looked back at him, her eyes reflecting both hesitation and a flicker of hope. The fear of opening herself up to someone she had never known was clear. But there was also a glimmer of something else, a hope that this might be the start of something new. I don't know if it'll be easy, she finally said, her voice soft. There's a lot we don't know about each other. Robert nodded. I know, but I'm willing to try if you are. Sophie looked down at David, then back at Robert. Okay, she said quietly. We can try. For the first time in years, Robert felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. It was not much, but it was enough. Enough to give him hope that despite all the loss and pain, there was still something left to hold on to. As he walked away from the cemetery that day, Robert's mind was a storm of emotions. The revelation that Sarah had kept such a monumental secret gnawed at him, and the thought of Sophie and David lingered in his mind. His once controlled and predictable life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. The city around him bustled with energy, but he moved through it on autopilot, shaken to his core. Back at his apartment, rain had started to fall again, tapping gently against the windows. Robert stood in the dim light, staring out at the city as memories of Sarah flooded his mind. Her laugh, the way she used to look at him, the dreams they had shared before everything fell apart. He had spent years preserving her memory, trying to keep her alive in his heart through grief. But now, with Sophie's revelation, he began to wonder if he had ever really known Sarah at all. Why had she hidden this from him? What had been going through her mind in those final months? The questions buzzed in his mind, unrelenting, demanding answers he wasn't sure he could ever find. Robert walked over to his desk, where he kept a collection of mementos from his life with Sarah, old photos, letters, little trinkets that had once meant something to them both. He picked up a photo of them from their early days together, back when everything had seemed so full of promise. They looked so happy, so in love. He couldn't reconcile that version of Sarah with the woman who had kept something so life-altering from him. Sitting down, Robert pulled out a worn notebook from the drawer. It was Sarah's journal, something she had kept on and off throughout their marriage. He had found it after she passed, but had never brought himself to read it, fearing it would only deepen his grief. Now, though, it felt like his only chance to understand. With a deep breath, he opened the journal. Her handwriting filled the pages, the familiar script that he had seen in countless notes and letters over the years. He began to read, scanning her thoughts on ordinary things, their dinners, vacations, moments they had shared. But nothing stood out, and he kept turning the pages, searching for anything that might explain why she had kept such an important part of her life hidden from him. Toward the back of the journal, Robert finally found it, a single entry dated just a few months before Sarah's death. As his eyes moved over the words, his heart began to race. I do not know what to do. I am terrified. How could I let this happen now, after all these years? Robert would never understand. He is so focused on the business, on our future, and I cannot be the one to take that away from him. He deserves more than I can give. I wish I could tell him, but I know it would destroy him. I cannot let him see me like this. I cannot let him know. Robert's chest tightened as he read. She had been afraid. Afraid of how he would react, afraid of how a pregnancy would change their lives. But why had she not trusted him? Why had she assumed he would not want to be a part of it? The realization hit him hard. Sarah had not kept Sophie a secret because she did not want him to know. She had kept it hidden because she thought it was for his own good. She had been trying, in her own way, to protect him from the burden of raising a child in the midst of their already complicated lives. Robert slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. It was not betrayal that had driven Sarah to keep Sophie from him. It was fear. Fear of how he might react, fear of how their lives would be changed. Perhaps, in some small way, she had even been trying to shield him from the pain she herself was feeling. But that decision had left its own scars. Sophie had grown up without knowing her father, and Robert had been robbed of the chance to be part of her life. And now, David's as well. He closed the journal, his mind reeling. There was no way to undo what had happened. No way to go back and fix Sarah's choices. But there was still a way forward. Sophie had come to him looking for answers, and now, more than ever, Robert knew he could not turn his back on her. He stood up, his resolve hardening. If he could do one thing right, it would be to be there for Sophie and David. He had already lost too much time. He was not about to lose any more. The next morning, Robert made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sophie. He had promised her he would try, and now, more than ever, he wanted to keep that promise. Unsure of how it would go, he picked up the phone and dialed her number, his heart pounding as he waited for her to answer. After a few rings, he heard her voice on the other end, soft but steady. "Hello? Sophie, it's me, Robert," he began, his voice betraying his nervousness. "I have been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and Robert held his breath, uncertain of how she would respond. Finally, Sophie replied, "Yeah, I think we do." Robert exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. It was not much, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The next time they met, it was in a quiet corner of a small cafe, away from the city's noise. Robert had chosen the spot carefully, intimate yet neutral, a place where they could talk without too many reminders of the past. He arrived early, adjusting his collar as he sat down, feeling nervous as he waited. His mind kept returning to Sarah's journal. The entry had given him a deeper understanding of her, but it had also intensified the ache of not being able to ask her why she had chosen to keep such a monumental secret. When Sophie entered, with David in her arms, she spotted him and walked over, her expression calm but cautious. There was a tension in her movements, like she was not sure how this conversation would go. "Hi," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She shifted David in her arms to make him comfortable, then looked up at Robert again. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," he replied, his throat tight with nerves. He glanced down at David, who looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "How is he?" Sophie gave a small smile, brushing a hand over the baby's head. "He's doing well, growing fast." A brief silence settled between them, both uncertain of how to begin. Finally, Robert cleared his throat, deciding to dive right in. "I have been thinking a lot about what you told me," he said quietly. "And I found something. Something that explains a little bit of why Sarah never told me about you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, intrigued but guarded. "What did you find?" Robert hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out Sarah's journal, sliding it across the table to Sophie. It's her journal from the last year of her life. She wrote about her fears, her worries, and why she kept you a secret." Sophie stared at the journal, her fingers grazing the edges of the cover without opening it. "She wrote about me?" Robert nodded. "She didn't mention you by name, but it's clear she was afraid. Afraid of how I would react, afraid of how having a child would affect our lives. She thought she was protecting me by keeping it from me." Sophie's expression softened, her hand resting on the journal for a moment before pulling back. "I spent my whole life wondering why she didn't want me," she said quietly, a hint of sadness in her voice. "It's hard to hear that it wasn't just about me, that she was trying to protect you too." Robert leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "It wasn't that she didn't want you, Sophie. I see now that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle everything. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. I think she was just lost." Sophie let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I always thought that finding out why she gave me up would bring me some kind of closure. But now it just feels complicated." Robert nodded. "I know it's not easy. But the one thing I have learned is that we can't change the past. We can only decide what to do with the present." There was a pause, and Robert could see the emotions flickering across Sophie's face. Sadness, confusion, but also a hint of relief, as if hearing these words about her mother had lifted a part of the weight she had carried for so long. "I don't know what to do with all of this," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've spent so much time feeling angry, At her, at you, and now, I don't know what to feel. Robert's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to say something to make it better, but he knew there were no easy answers. They were both navigating uncharted waters, trying to make sense of a past they hadn't shared. I understand, he said softly. I felt anger too. But maybe we can figure this out together. Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. Do you really want to be part of my life, after everything? I do, Robert replied without hesitation. I've already missed so much time, Sophie. I don't want to miss any more. If you're willing to give this a chance, I am too. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'm willing to try, but I need time, Robert. This is a lot to take in. Robert reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. I understand. We'll take it one step at a time. There's no rush. Sophie glanced at David, who had fallen asleep in her arms, and then back at Robert. He doesn't have a grandfather, you know, she said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. Robert's heart swelled. I'd like to change that, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. I think David would like that too. For the first time in what felt like forever, Robert felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile but unmistakable. He had spent so many years convinced that his life had ended the day Sarah died, that there was no path forward. But now, sitting with Sophie and David, he realized there was still something left to hold on to, something worth fighting for. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared past heavy between them. Yet, there was something new, a tentative connection, a chance at rebuilding what had been lost. As they left the cafe, Robert walked beside Sophie, feeling the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time that day. It was a small, almost imperceptible change, but it felt like a sign. And for the first time in years, Robert allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something more. The days following their meeting at the cafe were filled with cautious optimism. Robert and Sophie began seeing each other more often, though there was always a trace of hesitance, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that might break the fragile bond they were forming. Robert, for his part, was determined to show Sophie he was serious about being in her life, though he also understood her need for space. It was not easy. Each time he looked at her, he was reminded of how much he had missed, how much time had slipped through his fingers. As much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the past still weighed heavily on him. Often, his thoughts would drift back to Sarah and the choices she had made. He had spent years idealizing her, placing her on a pedestal. Now, he found it hard to reconcile the image of the woman he had loved with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret from him. One evening, after a particularly long day, Robert sat in his living room nursing a glass of whiskey. He hadn't seen Sophie in a few days, and while he wanted to reach out, he was also trying to respect her boundaries. It was a delicate balance, one he was unsure of how to navigate. He knew that pushing too hard might drive her away, yet not pushing enough felt like letting another chance slip away. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sophie. Can we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you. Robert's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He quickly replied, agreeing to meet her, and then leaned back, his mind racing with possibilities. What could she need to tell him? Was it about David, or maybe something about Sarah? Some new piece of the puzzle that might bring him closer to understanding everything? Thank you. You have listened to the first part of the story. Continued in the next video.